Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Confabulation, a podcast brought to you by Our Sisters House. And Our Sisters House is a DV advocacy organization here in Tacoma, Washington. And if you or anyone that you know is experiencing DV, please contact Our Sisters House at 253-383-4275 or visit our website at oursistershouse.com. For the upcoming announcements, I'd like to invite you to our fundraiser, and it is with Soul Revive Yoga and Wellness and Intentions Juice and Smoothie Bar this Sunday, which is November the 14th. Make sure to check out our social media to register for this event. You can attend in person or virtually, and the in person slots are going pretty fast. So I would encourage you to jump on our social media now and take part in this event on Sunday. And the virtual attendees will be able to attend with a discount. And I believe there is a discount coupon that is on the site. So join us for that event. So thanks, and we're ready for confabulation.
Okay, I just want to start us off with setting the framework for, because we're talking about human trafficking and moral panic today. And I want to set the framework that human trafficking is very real and important, but the national understanding that our society pushes is actually harmful and not entirely true. It invokes a false perspective of the majority of trafficking cases and turns the attention away from victims, and often results in POC communities being further targeted in public spaces. We also wanted to start off the framework for this conversation through a recent article about a mom and her daughter. She's a white woman with a biracial daughter, and they were stopped at the Denver airport because they were suspected of human trafficking for what the flight attendant stated as suspicious behavior, along the lines of not really talking to each other, not talking to the flight attendants. But the reality of the situation was that it was a racially biased target. And I got to collect my thoughts for a second. I wanted to bring in some statistics about human trafficking and how we have the lots of like awareness for human trafficking flyers and all things like that pushed all over our nation in spaces like the airport or in women's restrooms. And we need people to understand that the reality of human trafficking is it's incredibly unlikely for someone to be kidnapped or taken by a stranger and forced into what we understand as, like, we tend to see human trafficking as always strangers taking on other people and forcing them into situations where they're forced into prostitution. And that's just, it's not very common. There's not a whole lot of evidence for many real cases of that happening. Although it does happen sometimes, we actually need to turn the understanding to, or like the awareness to, most human trafficking cases are, or even kidnapping cases, are because of victims being targeted by people within their own families and friend groups, close communities. It's not strangers targeting strangers. It's the people that we actually know. I'd like to open it up to the rest of my co podcastees to bring in a little bit more of a perspective before I go any further.
So I think, excuse me, the statistic when you say that, okay, so we go back to the basic understanding. I think people would rather think it's a stranger than it's somebody that I know. So that's where the awareness we need to be aware and educated, and we just actually need to be aware, right? It's like if you're not suspecting of someone you know or a family member, that is so that's the last place we think or search in our mind, who could have my child, right? So you're thinking a stranger has grabbed, and it would never come into play into mind. It could be somebody right in your family, right in your house. So, in my mind, I guess I think, how do we really heighten the awareness and I guess get rid of the stigma, the stigma that it's always a stranger or it's someone that you don't know, when the statistics say totally different. It is probably someone that you know, and they could either be close to you or associated with the family. So how do you get rid of the stigma? How do you bring about the educational piece for that? How would you, in our minds, in my mind, how would you even start to make people aware?
Well, part of that is just talking. Like, we realize it's taboo, right? Like, talking about
Mhm,
certain things that are uncomfortable.
mhm,
And as realistic or unrealistic as it is like, you have to talk about things that are uncomfortable until it's not as uncomfortable, right? Like, um people, like race in general, for a lot of people it's an uncomfortable conversation, and you just have to talk about it and figure out what's the right thing to say and what's not the right thing. And it's never gonna there's never one right way to talk about it, right? Like, because what's right in with one person isn't going to be right with another person.
mhm,
And that's the same when you're talking about religion, sexual identity, sexual orientation, disabilities, either physical or invisible. I mean, there's so many, and this can go with immigration. This can go, I mean, the list, and I'm not trying to say this is an endless list, and I am sure I am missing tons of them, right? Like, I'm not trying to exclude anybody. I want this to include everybody. And
mhm,
so by not including everybody, it's I'm sorry, right? But like, the point is that, like, we have to talk about it, because by not talking about it, that's what's making the problems. And so what's happening here is we're saying, okay, it's happening in hotels, motels, and airports only. But is it really only happening there? No. Where is it
mhm,
starting from? Who's the starting target? It's going to be starting with the family members of, usually it's going to be Latinx, Native, Indigenous, Black, low income, no income, people with less stable homes, foster, or adoptive. I mean, like, those are
mhm,
just some of the many red, like, warning signs of, like, people that it's going to include, right? And so if we're only saying, oh, it's going to be at an airport, who's going to an airport? Obviously somebody who usually has a little bit more money because they can afford to go on a plane. Just one thing, because planes are expensive to fly on. So I would actually have assumed it would have been a bus. That's just like
mhm.
one thing I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys, because I couldn't have plane tickets. Somebody else would have to buy it for me. Um, but like, things like that, it's like, it's just certain topics that are taboo to talk about. They can't. We have to sit with our uncomfort, and sometimes sitting with our uncomfort is just something we have to learn in order to expand our horizons and really identify. like what's wrong or what's right, even it's what's right with society.
Right?
Another, oh, go ahead, Bethel.
Something that I found in my research was that 99% of abducted children are kidnapped by family members, usually in custody disputes, and only about 100 are kidnapped by strangers each year. And then, according to data from 2011, 92% of those 100 are recovered alive. So, 100 of those kidnapped by strangers. And then, according to the FBI, 609,725 people were declared missing in 2019, and 607,104 of those records were purged due to the person returning home, being found, or the record being falsely entered. So, just to put things into perspective of like how, yeah, stranger danger is real. Trafficking when it comes to like strangers can traffic other strangers, but you're more likely going to be in that kind of situation with somebody in your family or somebody in your personal circle, like social circles, which is like unfortunate, but we, like you said, like we need to talk about it. And I'm sure there's like organizations and activists doing that work too. So I just wanted to add that just because it helped me put things into perspective a bunch.
Yeah, and going off of that as well, another part that goes into our misunderstanding of human trafficking, one is that there are so many different things that are coded as human trafficking, so it's more of a big umbrella term, and then that makes it confusing for the general public to understand what is and isn't human trafficking, and ends up getting the whole umbrella term is chalked up to one image of this big bad monster that's the stranger kidnapping people, and there's this whole like trafficking ring hierarchy that runs nationwide or globally. Like it's a big thing. There's lots of people involved, and they're all interconnected. And there's not really evidence about that. That's not really likely. There can be trafficking rings, but it's not a whole network of people nationwide to globally. It's smaller groups of people that are working together. And then also the statistics we have about human trafficking is it's incredibly skewed because of the way that the data is gathered. There are many, just to throw some numbers out there, some of the language going around is that there's 1 million victims nationwide, but then there's also no way to really know how many victims there are because not everything is reported. So that's more of an estimate. And they get to that estimate often. One way that they get to that estimate is based off of calls made to the human trafficking hotlines, and most of the time it's based off of children that have run away from home, and that happens in many different cases. And so like there's a lot of reasons why a kid would run away from home. Oftentimes it's because they're in a not okay foster house, or there's DV in the home. There's all these different things, but because they're gone, it's like they automatically label it as human trafficking in their systems, although there's no other evidence as to what's going on. And then if that kid returns back home, there's no way to take that out of the system. And then if they run away again, or let's say 5 times in a year, and that same hotline has been called 5 times in a year, that marks 5 kids that are now in the system, even though it's the same person who goes back home and has no evidence of human trafficking being the issue at play. It's most likely DV in the home. Their needs aren't being met. There's other things that are needed and not human trafficking resources. And then that inflates these numbers. And then it's also multiple hotlines that are gathering the data. So then it goes into the different hotlines could be called about the same kids. So there's different places where the kids being counted multiple times in a year, and that just keeps inflating these numbers even more. So there's another statistic about 79,000 children in Texas alone. But when we look at the reality of cases, because there's not every case is reported, but the number of confirmed cases in a year nationwide, I can't remember what year it was rather recently. I feel like this is around 2014, but I could be mistaken. It was 500 confirmed cases nationwide of children and adults. So we go from these estimates of 1 million victims nationwide, 79,000 children in Texas alone, but only 500 confirmed cases. And that instigates this whole panic that is like nationwide moral panic to get out more awareness and put out these numbers more and more so everyone's aware, but then their awareness is misinformed and uneducated in what the actual signs are, because at the same time when they're pushing human trafficking awareness, the risk signs are oftentimes, especially for children, the same symptoms of being a teenager, like acting out or not going to school or not feeling well, being depressed. Like there's a lot of different things that are symptoms of more than just human trafficking. And the way our society is being educated is that this is just a sign of human trafficking, and it ends up dismissing real cases of DV in the homes and many other issues that need to be addressed. And then it also dismisses the ways of being able to recognize a child that actually is at risk of human trafficking. Because I now want to go into the definition, or like the many forms of human trafficking that are understood. The two main ones
Wait,
are going to be.
before you do that, that's
Oh, go
really
ahead.
important, is just only because you were saying it. One of the things that's like really important is noting that it's an exploitation. Trafficking itself is exploitation.
Mhm.
And I know you're going to go into it, but when people think of trafficking, they're thinking of like going over lines and going and like moving it around. And the whole issue about this is really it's some kind of entryway into some kind of exploitation. And so I just wanted, and you were totally on that point, and I know you're going into the definition of it, and I think that's really just something as a simple definition before you get into a legal or whatever the definition is. But it's kind of like when you're looking at the teens, usually they're promises of love or like a family or jobs, benefaction, like like more benefactor type stuff, or like there's like then there can be like the fraud and promises, but it's just like really it's usually like the higher likelihood is like they're missing that love or that family aspect. I think it's like 60% between the two of those five factors, which this is based off of Washington trafficking prevention, their facts. So I just wanted to make sure that when we talk about trafficking, it's like the term trafficking is it's really a type of exploitation. And so, Skylar, you may continue.
Thank you very much. I actually really appreciated that framework because it really goes into what I was about to say. I was going to start off with human trafficking is often misunderstood for the realities of human smuggling. So what that is there's no real laws that allow people to legally come into our country to get better opportunities. So then they have to find ways in and buy their way in through like people that'll smuggle them into the country. So they're not being kidnapped and taken here against the will and forced or coerced. It's that they're forced into finding a way out of their own country for their own well-being, and then that ends up getting them caught into a situation where they're in debt to the people that brought them over, and they're now caught into an exploitation situation, and at that point is human trafficking. But it's very different being kidnapped and brought over here and ending up in an exploitation situation rather than choosing to come over because you need to, and then the only way to survive at that point is exploitation. Those are two different frameworks, and the kidnapping aspect ends up overshadowing the realities of most people's experiences. And then the other aspect that I'd like to go into was that the commercial exploitation part for within our country, and especially when we're talking about youth, the kind of thing that we tend to mistake for what we think is happening with youth in human trafficking situations in America is that they were kidnapped from their family and now being sold. But the more realistic aspects, or more common, I'll say, not realistic, is that what Michelle was saying is that they needed some kind of stability. They had promises of love. They met someone that was a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and then that the combination of elements that are happening at play in their life lead into being sexually exploited. Or there is there are children being abused in their homes where they're being coerced by family members and being given stuffed animals or toys or presents, like things that they want to get in their home otherwise, and those items are used to keep them quiet and enable the abuse that is actively happening. And that is a form of commercial sexual exploitation of children. And that these kind of cases, these kinds of situations are what is most common and what goes overshadowed when we put up this big bad monster of human trafficking in this misunderstood image of what actually isn't the most common reality for these cases.
I think another one to not forget about is also like the peer-to-peer online of so whatever it is, if you're sending a picture for something on your Amazon wish list, or or you even tell your friend, look, you can do this and you can get something. Those are types of exploitation, even if you're not thinking about it, in those kinds of sense of the way. And of course, that's not including your family. That's including peer-to-peer or yourself. And it's not the same. It's not thinking of the harm at the moment. But there is harm that is there. You're giving something of yourself in order to receive something. And I think that's something that youth, even adults, are doing it, and that's what's kind of missing when we're talking about this. And it's a lot of time that's not what we're talking about, or that's not what the news is talking about, the radio is talking about. They're talking about somebody's going over a line, somebody's kidnapping somebody, somebody's taking somebody. And that's really not what is being seen or heard or witnessed. And that's not where the trauma is coming from. I mean, we're not negating that those are traumatic incidences and those are trauma for those individuals, but the traumatic incidences that are most often occurring are in these instances.
And those are the ones, Michelle, that we initially started out talking about. Those are the taboo ones. Those are the ones that are like swept under the rug, or those are the ones that those are the acts of exploitation that people don't acknowledge as being exploitation, right? So if you just look in a typical household and just say an uncle giving a child a toy, a stuffed animal, or a gift of $50 or whatever, right? I think in the mind in that household, oh, that's the uncle, he's allowed to. So your mind doesn't go, the mind doesn't go beyond the fact that this is a relative and he's being kind to his niece, nephew, or whatever, right? And so Yeah, that we never look at that as, we would never, unless you say it and hear it and made aware, you never look at, we would never say he exploited that child. But as we as we know, if there is an exchange for a sexual act or even touching the child, that becomes exploitation. Who thinks that? In a household, who thinks that? That we don't acknowledge it, and then that's where the taboo is. Like, we don't talk about that. We don't bring it. Like you're saying, it's like this big, it's a big tangible thing. I can see, I can hear, I can touch. There was a child, that child or a teenager or whatever came up missing, and commercial sexual trafficking is apparent, but it's like minimized, and it's a little thing, so we don't acknowledge it because we see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil.
And I think you made a really good point of like the uncle, right? I think most families have like that, either like dirty uncle, or that they don't
Mhm.
want to talk about, or the creepy aunt, or whatever it is in your family, or the person, and it's like, oh, and they give you like the candy, like they give the little the candy, like because like maybe they like potted, like touched, like scooted the little kid's butt or something, but you don't, like, maybe it was made the kid uncomfortable and then they gave him the candy. That's kind of a form. That's the initiation of it. That's,
Yes,
we all
yes,
know that kid felt uncomfortable. That kid felt uncomfortable. So like that's the start of it. And it's in every, I kind of want to say it's every culture, every community, everybody, all families are having that. And it's just,
yes.
we don't want to say like, hey, don't touch, you can't touch my kid like that, or you can't touch that kid like that. You can't touch that, my cousin like that, or my nephew, or like whoever it is. It's like, we don't want to talk about it. And I think bringing that uncle comment is just like a perfect statement that relates
Mhm.
to so many families.
And you're saying you don't want to say, you can't touch my kid, but you know what? If there's awareness, you can say it, and that's a warning. And I'm watching you or whatever. And I think that I think that bringing the awareness and it's brought out in the open. I don't know. I would think, then people start looking, and other households in the family are like, yeah, wait a minute. Kids are like, he's been touching me. It just needs to be the education, the awareness, so that they know this is not okay. And it is okay for you to speak up. And it is okay for you to say, that's not okay for you to touch.
And I want to make the point that even though so much of trafficking and exploitation happens within the family circle and social circles, I don't think I've ever seen any kind of warning from authorities, law enforcement that warns you of that.
Right.
I've seen a lot of posts about like, oh, this is a sign of trafficking. Like if you see something on your car, like on top of your car window when you're like out in the mall and coming back, like be careful, like don't grab it. And I've seen like um, police departments posting this on their Facebook or reposting it. And I did some research into it and saw that the reason why law enforcement doesn't debunk these statistics, that trafficking is a bigger problem than it actually is. In terms of like the numbers, obviously it is a problem, but they don't say anything about how the numbers are inflated, is because it kind of like justifies them to like over surveillance communities, especially communities of color. And then I also found that there is something called like white slavery, which is like the fear of white women being kidnapped by specifically by foreigners, so non-white foreigners especially, and forced into prostitution. And um, even though this wasn't happening. But because of that fear, and because of, like, society wants to protect white women from, the scary BIPOC or scary foreigners, especially, that ended up happening. And it just goes to show that something can get so out of hand that legislation comes out of it, which only hurts survivors and victims of trafficking, and people who aren't traffickers but end up being grouped up or labeled as a trafficker because of their job or because of their like citizen status in the United States.
This mindset of fear and ignorance and like not wanting to learn is what's endangering more people. And when I shake my head like this in disbelief, it's in utter shock that people can't be humble and learn what's really going on in different communities and areas. And it just, there, in the past, even the past couple of years, right, there's been talking of just looking around and trying to become humble. That's really all this is becoming humble. And it's not saying that like what's going on with you doesn't matter. It's being humble and trying to see where can we benefit not just ourselves but others. And that's what this is really asking for. And I still just meant like what you're saying is just you're right and it's wrong.
Yeah, I want to go a little bit more off of what Bethel was saying and wrap it back to if we follow the waves of moral panic in our nation about human trafficking, it we can see how it's just further strengthening the systems of oppression that we have set and the ways that our systems are failing. So there's, when it comes to legislation, there's an increase in legislation that that's to control the borders, like immigration laws. It makes it even harder for people to get into the country, which actually just increases the amount of human smuggling, and then that increases the risk of being trapped in an exploitation situation by the time you do get here, because increasing the legislation law on immigration doesn't stop people from coming in. It just makes it harder for them to. There's never going to be a stop of people trying to come into the country because there's all of these promises of a better life here. As much as that doesn't tend to work out.
But that hasn't even stopped it, because there's been an increase with trafficking with all those border increases because it's not happening outside. Sorry. Just that anecdote.
And then I also wanted to bring it back to the case of this most recent case of the mom and daughter being stopped in the airport because they were suspected of suspicious behavior and such. If we look at it's not clear if there has ever been an actual case of a child being taken against their will by a stranger on a plane. It's highly unlikely for there to be some kind of trafficking exchange through the airport because of the higher security and there's so many people. It's not the safest way of transportation if you're in actively like doing an illegal thing. And it just like with what Bethel was saying about law enforcement pushing false narratives to justify more surveillance of communities, especially communities of color, it just creates another reason to further target people of color in airports when we don't like the flight attendants don't even really need to have the training on recognizing signs of human trafficking in airports, just because it can further it allows them the chance to what is that word, the targeting of like the racial targeting,
Racial biasing of targeting.
Yeah, yeah, the like that, it just creates the space for that to happen more. It's not actually, there's no evidence that it's helping anyone, that they're saving anyone from any kind of trafficking situation. It just has created more and more instances of this happening. And this woman and her daughter being stopped in the airport is not the first case. When I was doing research on this and was listening to another podcast, they had recorded it of like a few years. It was a podcast from 2 years ago that started off talking about almost the exact same case. It was just different people. Um, and then, oh, there was something else as well that I wanted to pull in before we wrapped up. Oh my goodness, I'm on such a roll. It's all blanking. Yeah, I think I also just want to point out, instead of having the increased surveillance and awareness in airports and hotels and places like that, we need to have some stronger systems for like the foster care system. It's not safe for children in the foster care system, and it puts them at risk. We need to actually be educating the community about domestic violence and abuse and the systems of abuse and how that plays out in households. We need to be educating people about how to tell the actual signs of something going on that's like not just based in what a teenager is likely going to experience. Like I'm sure we don't have the time right now, but if anyone else has it off the top of their head of like the more specific to active trauma happening in a child's life signs, then feel free to share. I apologize for my brain having a bit of a buffer at the moment. And we need ways to have actual financial stability, economic stability within households across America, and I'm sorry. Someone else go ahead and take over.
I think you hit most of them.
I tried. It's just the gears are going. They're just
It's a
little
Friday.
Yep. Does anybody else have any last points they want to mention before we wrap up?
Well, I think the point that we all would want to just throw out there to our viewers and listeners: pay attention to the signs, and if you don't know that they are real signs, find out. There's information out there. If you have a suspicion or an inkling that someone that you know is, or you think they're red flags, there are lots of resources to check out what you even feel. Don't just drop it and then don't heighten it either, but go to the right resources for the right answers. So, with that being said, we'd like to thank you again for joining Confabulation in our segment on human trafficking and moral panic. Again, if you or anyone that you know is experiencing DV, please contact Our Sister's House at 253-383-4275 and visit our website at oursistershouse.com. I'd like to take that just a little further to, if there's anyone that you suspect, maybe a child that may be in an situation of exploitation, or you think or you want to know anything further or go further than the conversation today, contact Washington Trafficking Prevention. You can go to their website. I believe it's washingtontraffickingprevention.org. Again, thank you all for viewing Confabulation. Have a good weekend.